Good morning, Legacy Bible Church. Welcome again to another teaching. This is part 2 of the Epilogue of John. What exactly does Jesus feed his disciples? So Stephen's going to continue his teaching on that. And the slides are up there, and they are superimposed over Stephen, and that is his translation, Stavros, the Wooden Bible. This is John chapter 21. And if you would like that slide without that, or if you would like a copy of that, just send us an email. You'll see it right here beneath me, steve.goodall at lbcdfw.org. And that email will come right to us, and we will send you whatever we have been working on for that day, whatever you've heard. So we'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions, if you have any concerns, like we said last week, if you're reading through the scripture and nobody has really answered what that means. You know there's more depth to it, but nobody where you're currently at really gives a very full description. I remember when I was raised in the church, always went to church as a child and baptized in the church at a young age, went to all the classes, got my Bible in the youth group, got his name on it, it was all really great. Then went away from church for a while, then came back to church when Amanda invited us all back into church. And it was really, really great to be back home to church. But I can tell you that I never really, in all of my youth, really had a very deep understanding or relationship. It was just kind of something that we did as a family, and that was terrific. But I know, when, I don't know how long ago it was, Stephen, 14 years ago maybe? How long, Stephen? 14 years ago that we started going to church. And I'd start reading the Bible, and there was so much more in there as an adult that I'm reading that, and I'm wondering, what does that really mean? And didn't really get much of an explanation, and I'm in Bible studies, and I'm asking people, and, it's pretty much a Christianese answer. It's the same answer that's always there, but it always left me thinking that has to mean more. So Legacy Bible Church goes into the more. It goes into the layers underneath there that aren't well understood. And again, because they're not well understood does not mean that they aren't the truth of the scripture. And that's what Stephen teaches. That's what I love supporting. It is wonderful, freeing. It's just beautiful. We love to do this teaching. I hope you are getting as much out of it as we are in providing it. Again, reach out to us, steve.goodall at lbcdfw.org, and he'll be here with you in just a moment to continue teaching on John chapter 21. Get your Bibles out, open them up, see what a difference a translation makes. Welcome.
Good. All right. Well, good morning, Legacy Bible Church, and so glad to be with you again this morning, Sunday morning, streaming live out into the world, and for those who are with us. And we're going to continue our discussion that I began last week on what is often called the Epilogue of John. It's that last chapter of the Gospel of John where he narrates this very well-known but very unusual scene that takes place at the Sea of Galilee after Jesus is resurrected from the dead. And we're going to continue talking about that today. What does it mean? What is going on in that story? And I had before I do that, I'm going to preface with a couple of things. I had an opportunity here this last week to hear again my own words on really relating some of what Robin introduced here today. How did I first really come into the full realization of the full gospel? I always knew from the earliest days that I read the Bible back at the beginning of my own faith walk, which began in 2005. I began reading the scriptures and doing my best to correlate what I'm reading in the scriptures with what I'm being taught in my home church. And I'm just not seeing it line up. There are things in the scriptures that my home church is not teaching, is not talking about. And as I would bring it to my church leadership and the people that were teaching and the people that were mentoring me and begin to engage them in a conversation, just with, kind of a wide-eyed innocence. My perspective was, I'm the new guy on the block. I don't know. I want to know. And so my leadership at church were the sources of authority that I would go to with my questions. And it just became very apparent to me, not overnight, but over a period of 1 or 2 years of this, that there are just things in the Bible that my home church is really avoiding, I guess would be the most polite way to put it. They just simply didn't teach it, didn't talk about it. And they dealt mainly in the realm of the ministry of the Holy Spirit. And so that motivated me then to go to seminary and say, well, maybe I can go to a seminary and study independently of, of my home church and get my questions answered there. And I found out that the same dynamic took place at the seminary that I went to, that there were just things in the Bible that were not taught about and really weren't discussed. In fact, in my final years at this seminary, one of the professors in a fourth year class, it's a fourth year THM class, in fact, a class on research, specifically on the methods and processes of doing theological, biblical research. At the end of this course, the professor asked us, and there were about 30 of us in the class, and he asked us, how have we done here at teaching about the ministry of the Holy Spirit? And the class was just dead silent. Nobody was offering an answer. I'm sure most had opinions about it, but nobody wanted to jump up, including myself, and offer up our opinions to answer his question. And after kind of a pregnant pause, he said, well, let me answer the question for you. He said, we haven't done very well here teaching about the ministry of the Holy Spirit. And that would be true. And that would be true of my home church at that time, which I attended for almost 10 years. And so this was kind of the dynamic in the first decade or more of my faith walk, that I'm doing a lot, very active, very diligent to read the Bible, study about the Bible, using a lot of extra biblical sources, commentaries, going to seminary, engaging dialogue with my church leaders, all of these things to understand what does the Bible say? What is the story that is being told here in the Bible? And after a dozen years, I had a lot answered. I mean, I obviously gained a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, a lot of insights into the Bible and into the meaning of the scriptures. But there was still a lot that wasn't taught, and there was still a lot that I didn't understand. And so that all kind of culminated it into my final semester at this seminary. That was in the autumn of 2016. So with my favorite professor. I'll even tell you his name. His name is Dan Wallace. He's an internationally renowned biblical scholar of, or I should say, scholar of biblical Greek. He is the professor from whom I studied under and learned biblical Greek. And Dan Wallace has written an advanced Greek grammar that is used all over the world to teach biblical Greek. And I got to learn under the master. And in fact, over the course of my many years at this seminary, Dan Wallace and I actually grew close, and still today are friends, and we still keep in touch even today. And one of the reasons that I think that Dan Wallace was drawn to me was because of my passion as a man in my late 50s by that time, and a relatively new believer, very energetic and enthusiastic to learn as much as I can learn about the Bible and about biblical history, church history, and things of that nature. He was very taken by the fact that I didn't just take Greek because I needed to check a box to get my seminary degree, but rather I took Greek. In fact, my primary purpose in attending seminary, looking back, I can say would be in order to learn biblical Greek and biblical Hebrew, in order to learn the biblical languages. And so I think that that's one of the reasons that Dan Wallace and I had a natural affinity. So in my last semester at the seminary, I only had one class to take. It was Romans. It was advanced exegesis, meaning to study and draw out the meaning out of the original Greek language. That's exegesis, advanced exegesis of Romans, of the book of Romans, which is arguably probably the most difficult book to understand in the Bible, because it's a systematic presentation of the gospel by the Apostle Paul. And just like Peter said, some of the things that Paul wrote are difficult to understand. And there's nowhere where that applies more so than in the book of Romans. So I had a whole semester where that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to study Romans in the original language. And one part of the course was to exegete, meaning to translate and write commentary on 2 short passages. And that would be like 4, 5, 6 verses each, to study in very deeply 4 or 5 verses and write commentary on 4 or 5 verses. And me, in my kind of wide-eyed innocence, I said, well, I've only got one course for the whole semester. Why don't I just translate and exegete and write commentary on the entire book of Romans? And so looking back, it's almost laughable to presume to do that in just a 3 to 4 month period, but that's what I did. Started in August of 2016 and just began methodically walking through the book of Romans in the original biblical language, Greek, which is, we believe, very close. I don't think we can say it's exactly what Paul wrote because of the issues of transmission over 2,000 years, but we know, and we are confident through the science of textual criticism, we're very confident that what we have in the Greek text is very, very, very close to what Paul actually wrote. And so this is what I'm studying, translating, and exegeting, writing commentary on, starting at verse 1:1 and working all the way through the end, verse 16:27, and everything in between. A very huge project to undertake and presume to accomplish in just 4 months. And as Robin will attest to, after 4 months of basically 7 days per week, 10 to 12 hour days per day, sometimes longer, rarely with a day off or a short day, by the middle of December, in this final course at Dallas Seminary, I had made a pass all the way through Romans. And I call it a pass because that is a fairly quick pass to accomplish such a huge task. It was a couple of hundred pages, about 230 pages of work. And here's what happened in that semester. Something happened for the very first time. During the course of that semester, in translating and exegeting and writing commentary, word by word, phrase by phrase, sentence by sentence through the whole book of Romans, it dawned on me, it's almost like I use the term the fog lifting. You hear me say that from time to time. The fog slowly lifted over the course of that semester, in that I saw and I understood Paul's argument, what he was saying, what he was meaning in this systematic theology of the Christian faith, this most difficult book of the New Testament, this systematic theology of the Christian faith. I understood through Romans, finally, what Paul was arguing. And what he was arguing for, what the case he was presenting, the demonstration of the gospel that Paul was presenting in Romans, finally dawned on me. I finally saw it. And it was breathtaking. I mean, there was multiple times where I think my chin was just on the ground as I was seeing and understanding what Paul was writing. Because it was not what was being taught in my home church. It was not what was being taught in my seminary. It was not anything that I had seen or read or heard in the church or any other sources, other than in walking through the original language of the book of Romans. And what really brought me to a cathartic event that I could really feel confident that this really was a good, sound, accurate understanding that I was seeing in the book of Romans was that as I walked through it, up to that point, my favorite English translation was the New American Standard Version. And I like the New American Standard. I would still recommend it today as in terms of published versions because it's an essentially literal translation. But what I learned through this work, working through the entire book of Romans, is I found about 24 places, literally, 20 to 30 places in the book of Romans where the English translation in essentially what are supposed to be ostensibly essentially literal translations, I found 20 to 30 places just in the book of Romans that were corrupted. And I say that with a little bit of trepidation because that's a rather serious accusation, if you will, to say that such a renowned translation that is used by so many. It's the recommended translation of the seminary that I was attending. That's why I was using New American Standard. And to say that I found over 24 corruptions of the text, and you can maybe more politely say alterations of the text, but it's still the same meaning. It's a serious thing to say, but it's true. And here's kind of how I would characterize a holistic look at these alterations, these corruptions in translating from Greek into English. They all occurred at in a particular realm of Paul's argumentation where he is arguing, his rhetorical argument is for what we have come to refer to here at Legacy Bible Church as a two-dimensional plan of salvation. God has a two-dimensional plan of salvation. And what Paul is presenting in Romans is a two-dimensional theology of justification. And there is forensic justification. That's what we call the near purpose of God's salvation plan, where God acts sovereignly to give faith to believe. And that is what makes a child of God, a new creation. That's the near purpose. But almost very little of Romans is actually about that aspect of God's salvation plan. Why? Because Paul is writing Romans to the children of God. He's writing Romans to the church. He's not writing Romans to the lost. Paul's writing Romans for the benefit of those who have forensic justification, those who are now under the near purpose of God's salvation plan, those who have received the gift of faith to believe in Jesus Christ and his work on the cross. That's what the near purpose is. That's what makes a child of God. And so Paul begins the book of Romans with that very thing. And in Romans 1:6, he refers to the called of Jesus Christ. This is his audience. This is who he's writing to. And the called of Jesus Christ are those who have believed into what Paul wrote in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 1. Those who have believed into the good message, the gospel, the euangelion of God. And then virtually the rest of the book of Romans deals with encouraging, educating, exhorting the children of God to walk fully in the gospel, in the fullness of the gospel, where he calls, Paul's terminology, he calls the end purpose of God's salvation plan. He kind of wraps Romans in this concept at the beginning and the end, verse 1:5, verse 16:26, with this concept called the obedience from faith. It's kind of like bookends on the book of Romans. God gives faith to believe. You're the called of Jesus Christ. You're a child of God. And God wants something out of that. God wants the obedience from faith. You have faith to believe. It's a gift from God. God wants obedience from faith. And so the entire book of Romans is kind of bookended with this concept of the obedience from faith. Look at it for yourself. It'd be good for you to see this for yourself in your English translation. Go to Romans 1:5 and Romans 16:26, and you'll see that concept there kind of wrapping like bookends on Romans, the obedience from faith. That's what Paul's writing about in Romans. So then a good question will be, well, what does that mean? Well, Paul kind of reaches the crescendo, the high point of Romans, right at the beginning of chapter 12, where he refers to, and I'll just quote it, I urge you, brothers and sisters, by the inner mercies of God, present your body a sacrifice, living, holy, and well-pleasing, which is your spiritually, well-pleasing to God, by the way, which is your spiritually spoken service of worship. That's the obedience from faith. That you present your body as sacrifice into this realm of spiritually spoken service of worship. That's the obedience from faith. And Paul explains it then in verse 12 too. He says, and don't be conformed to this present temporal age, in other words, the world, but be transformed by the renewing of the mind, that you might prove what is the will of God. It's the realm of doing the will of God. That which is good and well-pleasing, second time he's used that term, good and well-pleasing and perfect. This realm of spiritually spoken worship is a realm of sacrificial worship and is good and well-pleasing to God and perfect. It represents the perfection of God. And that's why where you see in the scriptures that whether it's Jesus in the New Testament Gospels or God in the Old Testament in Torah, it says, be perfect as I am perfect. Be holy as my Father in heaven is holy. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. This realm of spiritually spoken worship, the end purpose of God's salvation plan, the obedience from faith, is that realm of holiness, of perfection, of the righteousness of God. This is what Paul is writing about in Romans. This is what dawned on me in that last semester at seminary with my favorite professor of biblical Greek, Dan Wallace. And again, and so this is where I'm coming to with this. The key to my conviction that this is Paul's argument. This is what Paul was arguing for in the book of Romans. He was arguing for this end purpose of God's salvation plan, that the children of God, those who have faith to believe, would be spiritual worshipers of God in spirit and in truth. And this is not just whatever you want or think worship should be. It's not 3 songs on Sunday morning. It's not studying your Bible for 15 or 30 minutes in the morning before you start your day. This is not the worship that Paul's talking about. It's not being a good mother or father to our biological children. It's not being a good employee at work. These aren't the realms of worship that Paul's referring to here. Paul's referring to a very particular kind of worship that is from heaven. That's why in 2:29 he refers to that in order that the praise might be from God and not from men. This spiritually spoken worship is a realm of worship and praise that literally is from heaven. This is what Paul's writing about. And so when the closer Paul gets to this realm of spiritually spoken worship in the book of Romans, the more, as Peter said, the more difficult the things Paul wrote are to understand. And so, because historically the church had very early, in its earliest days, had walked away from the fullness of the gospel. They didn't like it. They were offended by it. Very early in the church's history, Paul's letters were reinterpreted through a theological lens that only recognizes the near purpose of God's salvation plan, does not recognize or acknowledge that there is a spiritual realm of spiritually spoken worship that is really the major substance of what Paul was writing about. This also applies, by the way, to the other New Testament documents, but I'm talking specifically about Romans here. So in this semester, in the autumn of 2016, I am seeing I was incredulous as I discovered, and actually a little upset, to say the least, that the English translations had been altered or corrupted in these places that are arguably difficult to understand, where Paul is laying out the case for this end purpose of God's salvation plan. The text of the English translation, and I'm speaking here specifically about NASB, would be altered in these places so that it could be kind of forced to conform with this near purpose of God's salvation plan. A one-dimensional view of the salvation plan of God, rather than the 2 dimensions that Paul's writing about, reflecting God's 2-dimensional plan of salvation. And so it was through the course of discovering each of these individually, each of these alterations and corruptions, and being able to see exactly what the editors of the NASB were intending to accomplish with their alteration. Theologically, to reorient the gospel, if you will, toward this one-dimensional view. Rather than leave the text alone, translate it essentially literal to what Paul was writing, and just leave the difficult things to understand difficult to understand. They didn't do that. They altered the text so that a reader in English would see and believe that Paul is writing about this realm of forensic justification, this realm of faith to believe. That's all there is. And so the English translation in NASB, and I would say all of the English translations that are available today, have these inherent corruptions that are brought into the text because of a faulty, the wrong theological lens of the one doing the translating. And so seeing these corruptions of the text from the Greek into English, where the English text does not accurately represent what Paul wrote in the Greek text. That's what convinced me that I'm on the right course. And then also this, that when you understand what Paul's arguing for here, that he's arguing for this end purpose of God's salvation plan, he's exhorting the children of God to become spiritual worshipers of God. When you see that, I became convinced that it's very important to stay as close to the Greek text, as close to what Paul was writing as is possible to bring into the English, because any alterations of the text from what Paul wrote could only serve to water down, to begin to obscure the argument that Paul's making. I saw that very clearly. And so I came away from that semester with a very strong conviction that my job as a translator of the Greek text, in order to convey the arguments that are being made, whether it's in the Gospels or whether it's in Acts or the epistles or even Revelation, that I've done some work in and look forward to doing a lot more someday. I am just so convinced and so convicted that my job as a translator is to do no paraphrasing, but to stay as close to the Greek text as I can, because that's the only way to preserve this amazing gospel that's being told in the New Testament, that is pointing to this realm of spiritually spoken worship, that it is what primarily and predominantly, that's what the Gospels are arguing toward in Jesus' earthly ministry. It's what Acts is portraying, this emphasis on the children of God and spiritually spoken worship, and what all of the epistles are emphasizing. And you know this from the long teaching that we've done in 1 John, that we're still engaging, that's exactly what John is teaching. And the best early example in 1 John is verse 1-3, where John refers to two realms of fellowship in verse 1-3, where he is talking about what they have seen and what they have heard and what they're giving account of. And he says, in order that, and when he says the in order that means that we're sharing all of this with you for a purpose. And a purpose is that you might have fellowship with us, John wrote. And that means basically that you will understand what I'm writing and you will accept it as the truth. That's what John's meaning by saying, in order that you might have fellowship with us, understand what I'm writing about the gospel in this epistle, 1 John, and receive it as truth about the gospel and as truth about your obligations then as children of God under the gospel. And then he finishes verse 1-3 by writing, and then our other fellowship with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. two realms of fellowship. One is understanding the gospel through teaching like we're doing here. And for John, it was in the form of his letter. That's a realm of fellowship. What we're doing here at Legacy Bible Church right now is what John would refer to as our fellowship in 1 John 1:3. In order that you might then have our other fellowship with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. It's a different realm of fellowship. It's the realm of fellowship that Paul called in Romans 12:1, our spiritually spoken service of worship. And yes, church, that's what he wrote about in chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians. This is the realm of speaking in tongues, rightly understood, which I will say the charismatic church has misunderstood that realm of speaking in tongues. They have not taught, have not characterized speaking in tongues accurately and rightly for what it is. But rightly understood, it is the realm of spiritually spoken worship. It is the realm of our other fellowship with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. It is the realm of the obedience from faith. God gives faith to believe. He wants obedience from faith into our other fellowship with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. An example of the corruptions in English translation, go look at your translation of 1 John 1:3. And what it'll look like, it'll read something like, in order that you might have fellowship with us, and then the NASB writes, which is our fellowship, which is fellowship with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. In other words, they take those two realms of fellowship and they make them the same. And it's a gross corruption of the Greek. That is not what the Greek says. Clearly, John, unambiguously, it's not even like if, maybe, well, it seems to. No, he is just absolutely, clearly unambiguous about the fact that these are two separate realms of fellowship. Yet the English translations corrupt the text, they alter the text to make them appear that our fellowship is fellowship with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. And various English versions accomplish that same corruption in various different ways. So go look at your English translation. Go look at 1 John 1:3 and see for yourself exactly what I'm saying. That what you're reading in your English translation combines those two realms of fellowship. And what I'm saying to you here is that the Greek text is unambiguous. These are two separate realms of fellowship. And so that's what I discovered in Romans, is corruptions like that over and over and over again through the book of Romans, that as much as anything else is what helped me to say that there is so much corruption and so much alteration of the text from the Greek into English in these difficult to understand passages that then make it impossible for a reader in English to see the argument that Paul was making. Whether you understand it or not, it's gone. It's been erased. It's been obliterated. And the English text, the way it reads, would lead a reader to believe that there's nothing but this near purpose of God's salvation plan. That he gives faith to believe, and that's it. There is no end purpose of God's salvation plan. That this near purpose is his purpose, and that's it. That's what the corruptions in the English translation leave the reader in English no other alternative, because the end purpose through these alterations has been erased. It's gone. That's how I knew that I'm on the right track in my translation and my exegesis out of the original language. And so that might be what I would call the genesis of Legacy Bible Church. And that is essentially why we have a teaching ministry, why we have Legacy Bible Church, is to bring back this fullness of the gospel, an understanding of the fullness of the good message. And what I have since found, I've now translated about half of the New Testament, is that this is the argument in the Gospels. This is what the Gospels are pointing toward. This is what the book of Acts is representing, that there's a near purpose, and more than that, because that's God's sovereign work, more than that, there's this obedience from faith. That is what the epistles represent, and that is what the book of Revelation represents. That God is looking for worshipers in spirit and in truth. John chapter 4, verses 23 and 24. The Father wants worshipers worshiping him in spirit and in truth. This is the realm of your spiritually spoken service of worship. Fellowship with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. Yes, church, speaking in tongues. This is the end purpose of God's salvation plan. This is exactly, without any ambiguity, though it may be difficult to understand, unambiguously, this is what Paul is arguing for in the book of Romans. And I saw that in that semester in the spring of 2016. And that is why we're standing here teaching you biblical exposition. We're teaching you what do the New Testament documents say. And those of you that have been with us for a long time know that we're all over the Bible. We're in the Old Testament, New Testament. We're in the fullness of the New Testament. We've taught virtually out of every book in the New Testament, and we'll continue to focus on 1 John until we finish it, doing an occasional detour. And so right now we're doing a detour into the Gospel of John. And one of the things I want to say here before I pick up on the epilogue of John is to review again. I've taught this in the past, but it's important for you to know. You need to understand, why did John write a fourth gospel? He's writing at the end of the first century. This is a full generation after the other three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were written. They wrote in somewhere in the realm of the early 60s. And John writes the fourth gospel somewhere in the realm of the late 80s, maybe even into the early 90s. It's a whole generation beyond the other three synoptic gospels. And AD 70 has occurred where Jerusalem was destroyed, and the synoptics were written in a context, an environment where the church was largely led by Jews. And now John is writing after the destruction of Jerusalem, about 2 decades afterwards, and he's writing in Ephesus. And so he's writing in a completely different context, where now the church leadership is transitioning to Gentiles and is becoming very much a Gentile-led church. And John is a Jew. He was one of the original disciples with Jesus and the last of the apostles. So the question should be, why did John, at the end of his long life, say that, well, I'm 80, 90 years old, however old he was at the time, I think I'm going to write down some of my experiences and my memories about Jesus. Why did he do that? Keep in mind that writing in the ancient world is not like writing today. You don't just go back down and spend $2 and buy a paper notepad and an inexpensive pencil or pen and able to start recording. Back then, you did it on parchment, largely on parchment in that part of the world. In fact, Ephesus, that realm of Near Asia, was very famous for its manufacturing industry, if you will, of creating parchment for writing on. Parchment are animal skins, and they were very good. They lasted for a long time, much longer than papyrus. And so Near Asia was a very significant supply industry for parchment in the first century. And so John's writing in Near Asia, in Ephesus, and he's writing on parchment. So parchment wasn't cheap. It was very expensive. It took a lot of labor to take an animal skin and bring it through a laborious long process to where it had been prepared in sheets that someone could then write on. And then, of course, writing on parchment was a very slow, tedious, methodical process. You can't just get out your rubber eraser and erase a mistake. You've got to make sure that what you're writing is exactly what you want to write, and you write it exactly the way you want it written. And so it's a very difficult, very laborious process. And then, mixed with all of that, very few people in the first century understood grammar well enough to craft it into written texts. So very often, scribes were incorporated, and you see this even in some of Paul's writings where he attributes at the end of a letter amanuensis, which would be someone who is actually doing the writing. They had good handwriting and could help with the things of grammatical issues in making the recording. All of this, and most amanuenses, most of them are not going to do it for free. Maybe they did in the church, but most of them did it for a living. It was actually an occupation in the ancient world to be a scribe, to do this kind of work. So all of this is in the realm of when somebody is going to write a large document like the Gospel of John. It's the fifth longest book in the New Testament. And so it's very long and takes a lot just to record one copy of it. And of course, John didn't intend for it just to be one copy there at Ephesus. He wrote it for the church generally. So the intention was that he wrote the gospel, and there were going to be many copies, accurately scribed to send to various churches all over the Roman Empire and even beyond the Roman Empire. John's undertaking this endeavor late in the first century. He's 80 years old, maybe older, maybe even in his 90s. We don't know exactly how old he was. All we know is he was a very young man in the days of Jesus when he participated in the Last Supper in AD 33. He was a very young man, and now we're some 60 years later in Ephesus. So if he was in his late teens, early 20s in AD 33, you can see he's going to be in his 80s, maybe even into his early 90s in this period when he is writing the Gospel of John. And so I want you to kind of keep these things in mind here and just begin to ask questions and begin to visualize in your mind what's going on, what's happening here. That why didn't, John, for gosh sakes, why didn't you write it down when you were 30, 40 years old? It's fresher in your memory, you're younger, you have more energy, you got more time on your hands, yada, yada. Ask all of those kinds of questions. They're legitimate questions to ask, and believe it or not, they do have an answer. In fact, as you can probably surmise, we're going to talk about that answer here. Why did John write a fourth gospel? We already had three gospels, the synoptics. Why did he presume all the way 60 years after Christ, 30 years after his brother apostles wrote the synoptics, a full 30 years later, he gets up one morning and says, well, I guess I'm going to write a fourth gospel today. That's not how it happened. What happened, and the reason that John felt the urgent need to write a fourth gospel, is that the synoptics were being misinterpreted. A theology promoting the near purpose of God's salvation plan and dismissive of the end purpose of God's salvation plan was really growing and taking root in the church. Not least so as led by the church at Rome, which at that time, what we call in scholastic theological circles proto-orthodoxy, the early development of what would become Catholic orthodoxy, the tradition held and promoted by the church at Rome that was very, because they were at Rome and could use the strong arm of Roman secular authorities, they were a very influential, very powerful church at Rome. And they were not shy about using bullying tactics and even violent persecution to make sure that their theology, their preferred way of practicing Christianity was spread throughout the Roman Empire. And so John, at the end of the first century, is seeing this, and he's reacting to this. And not least that the synoptic gospels, which are good, they're accurate, there's not a problem with the story they tell and the way they're telling the story, but they're being misinterpreted. They're being, in the way that they're taught, they're being corrupted. And the main issue is this: it centers on what is called the Paschal controversy, or the Passover controversy, and if you will, the Lord's Supper controversy. In theological scholastic circles, you'll hear it called the Paschal. Paschal just means Passover, by the way. You'll hear it just simply referred to as the Paschal controversy. And this is what John is addressing. The Paschal controversy centers mainly on this. I'm going to try and keep it really simple because I want you to have a sense for what's going on here. And this will also give you insight when you read the synoptics and you read the Gospel of John and you see some differences. You're going to have some insight into why the differences, what's going on with those differences, and some understanding, some knowledge. It's going to be interesting on one level, but it's going to be with respect to your faith, theologically, it's going to be very important, very critical for you to see this distinction. Why is there a difference in the representation of the Passover, of the Lord's Supper, of the terminology they use in the two Gospels? In the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when they refer to the Passover, they are referring to the Lord's Supper. They're referring to the Passover. They call the Passover the meal. In fact, Jesus himself refers to it as the Passover. They're referring to that meal in the upper room on the night before Jesus' crucifixion, that the disciples and Jesus shared together, that meal, the Last Supper in the upper room. The synoptic Gospels call the Passover, the Paschal, Passover. And so what happened is that the adherents, the followers of proto-orthodoxy, mainly centered in Rome, that's an evolution out of Jewish Christianity that was centered under the church at Jerusalem under James, the brother of the Lord. It is the same tradition that was held at Rome and that then, I guess, morphed into a quasi-Judaized Christianity after AD 70 and Gentile leadership took over at Rome. What I'm calling at this early period, proto-orthodoxy, or very early Orthodox, Catholic orthodoxy in its development. They being the Church at Rome and Catholic Orthodox tradition, they were interpreting the synoptics that these references to Paschal, eating the Passover, have to refer to Passover day. And therefore they assigned a date that, well, then, this must have been eaten on Passover day, because Jesus is calling it Passover. And Jesus himself is saying they're eating the Passover. And so it cannot have been anything other than Passover day. Otherwise, it's inaccurate. Otherwise, it's unreliable. Why were they motivated to do that? The date. Passover on the Jewish calendar is Nisan 15. But the adherents to the full gospel, the adherents which included Paul and John, who kept the full gospel and who recognized and wrote about this end purpose of God's salvation plan, knew and understood that no, the Last Supper occurred on the day before Passover. It did not occur on Passover. It occurred on the day before Passover, which was Nisan 14. That's the Jewish month, and the 14th day of Nisan, the month of Nisan, is the day that they had the meal in the upper room. The day before Passover is the day of preparation. And so, in the Gospel of John, in order to correct that misunderstanding and that misinterpretation, John wrote in the Gospel of John that this meal in the upper room was the dinner. He did not refer to it as Passover. All of the references in the Gospel of John to Passover are for the next day. John is making it very clear in his Gospel that the meal eaten in the upper room was not eaten on Passover day. The meal in the upper room that the synoptics call the Passover was eaten on the day of preparation. And John makes very clear in his gospel, because he only refers to Passover as the next day. And in fact, he makes it crystal clear in, I believe it's verse 1936, at the end of his gospel. He wants to make sure, if you haven't understood my purpose already, that this is not Passover day, it's the day before Passover. Let me clarify it for you one more time. When he writes in 1936 and refers to the high Sabbath day, go look at it. I want you to see that in your English translations. John 19:36, where John refers to the next day, the day following this crucifixion, as the high Sabbath day. And so you should ask when you read that, what is a high Sabbath day? A high Sabbath day happens once every 7 years, and it's when Sabbath, Saturday, the last day of the week, coincides with Passover. And so when John refers at the end of his gospel, right, and he's already referred to Passover maybe a half dozen times as referring to the day after Jesus' passion, the day after he died on the cross. And here at the end of the gospel, after the passion, after Jesus has died on the cross, he refers to the next day as a high Sabbath day, where he is removing all question and all doubt that the Passover has not happened yet. The Passover is the next day, a high Sabbath day. So we can know Jesus had his Last Supper on the day of preparation, the day before. And keep in mind, the Jewish day begins at sunset and ends at sunset. It's not like our days in the modern world or even in the Roman world, where the day begins and ends basically at dawn. In the Jewish context, the day begins and ends with sunset. So the meal eaten in the upper room was on the evening of Nisan 14, and then on that same day, before the next sunset, Jesus was crucified. So the meal in the upper room and the crucifixion occurred on the same Jewish day, on the day of preparation, on 14 Nisan. And the next day was Nisan 15. And so John wrote to clear up that Paschal controversy. And how did it become a controversy? It became a controversy because in the Roman church context, in the Catholic Orthodox context, they said, well, Passover occurred. Jesus was crucified on the Passover day. And so that caused them then to celebrate the resurrection day. That's the reason why in the Catholic Orthodox context, they celebrate the day after Passover. They celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. But in the context of Pauline theology, Johannine theology, the New Testament letters, in that context, they celebrate and they make their focal point. They're not ignoring the resurrection, but their focal point is the day of the crucifixion, the day that Jesus ate the Passover in the upper room with them and then went to the cross, which was the day before Nisan 15 Passover. And the reason they celebrate that is because that's the day that represents what we do out of the obedience from faith. That we can share in the death of Jesus Christ is exactly what Paul wrote and exactly what Paul meant in Romans 6:5. If we become united ones in the likeness of his death, that's why the focus on Nisan 14, then surely we shall be of his resurrection. Paul wrote in Romans 6:5. And so the primary day of the year to celebrate Jesus' passion in the Pauline Johannine context is on Nisan 14, is on the day that on the Jewish calendar that coincides with the crucifixion of Jesus, that coincides with the day that the disciples ate the Passover with Jesus in the upper room. And so all of the churches in the ancient world fasted before their celebration, whatever day it was on. So you had two different traditions happening here. In the Pauline churches, Johannine churches, they would fast in advance of Nisan 14 to represent that period of time that Jesus was dead. And then on Nisan 14, because that's the day the disciples ate the Passover, ate the Lord's Supper, the day of Jesus' crucifixion. That's the day, listen very closely here, church, very important for you to grasp this. That's the day that the Nisan 14 churches, the Pauline churches, the Johannine churches broke their fast. They broke their fast on the day that the disciples ate the Passover in the upper room, and on the day, the same day, that Jesus was crucified on the cross. Why? Because in the fullness of the gospel, it's when we share in the death of Jesus Christ, when we share in his death, the likeness of his death. That then is the realm where we share in the Passover meal with our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. That's God's part. Our part is to become sharers in the likeness of his death, and then God enters in and feeds, provides the Lord's Supper. It happened on the same day. And so the adherents of the Pauline churches and the Johannine churches, they recognize a dying to self and a Passover meal as concurrent, same day, happening on Nisan 14. That's when they celebrated it. But the churches of Rome, in the proto-Orthodox environment, what would become ultimately fully developed Catholic Orthodoxy, they looked at these churches in Asia and Palestine and Syria and elsewhere that are following this 14 Nisan tradition, and they're looking at that and saying to them, they're breaking their fast and calling it Passover according to the Jewish calendar, even though it was on Nisan 14. They're saying they're having Passover feast according to the Jewish calendar. And so they just caricatured it and said they're simply following old covenant Jewish tradition. Even though Jewish tradition was a meal on Nisan 15, not Nisan 14. Nevertheless, the Catholic Orthodox Church looked at the 14 Nisan Pauline Johannine churches, and rather than understanding their faith practice about the end purpose of God's salvation plan, that the dying to self and sharing in the Lord's Supper are concurrent, they happen at the same time, just like it's represented in the Gospels. All four of the Gospels, in fact, all represent the Lord's Supper and the dying, the cross, on the same day. Rather than understand that this ritual, liturgical breaking of the fast on the Jewish calendar day, Nisan 14, rather than recognizing that they are dying to self, they are becoming in the likeness of his death, and in their spiritually spoken worship, they are sharing in the Lord's Supper. This is all happening on the same event. That's what's being represented in the 14 Nisan tradition. Rather than recognizing and acknowledging the full theological reality of that Nisan 14 tradition, the Catholic Orthodox Church looked at that and said, they're just following the Jews, the Old Covenant Jews. They're still practicing the Passover feast exactly like the Jews. It was a lie, it was a distortion, it wasn't true, but that's how they were characterized. That's how the tradition was assassinated. That's the basis that Catholic Orthodoxy used to attack this 14 Nisan tradition. They looked at them and said, they're just following the Jewish calendar. And they're still keeping the Jewish Passover feast. Not giving, because I think they knew. I don't know how they could not know because the churches were so close. Rather than acknowledging that, no, this has to do with worship to the Father in spirit and truth. This has to do with the dying to self and the Lord's Supper in that spiritual realm of fellowship with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. Rather than recognize that, they said they're just like the Jews. They're not practicing the new covenant faith. They're still practicing and walking in Old Covenant Judaism. That's how they were attacked. That's the Paschal controversy for which John wrote. John basically wanted to tell the proto-Orthodox, or in a century or so to become Catholic Orthodoxy, he was telling them, no, the Synoptic Gospels are not saying Jesus was crucified on the Jewish Passover day, Nisan 15. When they use the term eating the Passover, they're referring to that same meal that I, John, authoring the fourth gospel, am making very clear was eaten on the day before Passover, on Nisan 14. Don't misinterpret the synoptics, John is saying in his writing the fourth gospel. That was his primary, main purpose late in the first century to write the fourth gospel, was to clarify unmistakably that this attack on John's churches and traditions, 14 Nisan traditions, that are representing the end purpose of God's salvation plan, the dying to self, into the wedding feast, the Lord's Supper. John was clarifying that this meal was eaten and Jesus was crucified on Nisan 14, the day before Passover, not on the Jewish Passover day. And of course, that wasn't received by the church at Rome. In fact, for most of the second century, almost all of the second century, the Gospel of John and the letters of Paul remained hated and unused by Catholic Orthodoxy at Rome. You won't see the writers at Rome in the second century quoting Paul or quoting John, whether it's Justin Martyr in the middle of the second century or some of the writers at Rome in the latter part of the second century. You won't see it. They don't use John. They don't use Paul. They didn't like this 14 Nisan tradition, and they weren't going to use the New Testament documents that are talking about it, pointing to it, representing it. They would only use the Synoptic Gospels because, keeping their misinterpretation, they could say that Jesus was crucified on Passover, and so the main focal point of celebration then should be on Sunday, the resurrection day. And so the Catholic Orthodox tradition sealed in all of the churches that they influenced, celebrating the Paschal meal, if you will, celebrating the Passion, the crucifixion, and mainly the resurrection on Resurrection Day, on a Sunday. And so they, rather than using the Jewish calendar, they established that, well, we will do it on the same day each year, the first Sunday after the Jewish calendar Passover day. That's why you see Easter shifting around from year to year, is that it's always going to fall on a Sunday following the Jewish Passover day. And so that's why you see the two traditions. That's why you see the difference in terminology, if you will, between the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John. The Synoptic Gospels are accurate. They're representing the Passion and the Gospel the right way. They were calling this meal in the upper room the Passover meal, never intending that it would be interpreted that meal was being eaten on the Jewish Passover day. That was never their intention. Jesus was reinterpreting the Passover through the lens of the cross. The Passover which the Jews ate on Nisan 15, Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of the living God, was reinterpreting the entire Passover event through the lens of the cross. And so Jesus ordered and ate the Passover meal on the same day in advance of the cross, so that by that the disciples, which is us today, could see this Lord's Supper, Passover meal, through the lens of Jesus dying on the cross. Why? Because that's our access to the Lord's Supper. When we become united ones in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall be of his resurrection. And that's why Jesus wrote, that's why Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Near the end of the chapter, he wrote about the Lord's Supper. In fact, it's the earliest recorded record we have of the Lord's Supper. 1 Corinthians was written about 4 or 5 years before the Synoptic Gospels were written. So Paul wrote about the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians, and he finished in, you can see that in 1 Corinthians 11, 23 through 25. And then in 1 Corinthians 11, 26, Paul writes this. Listen, catch this. He writes, as often as you do this, what? Participate in the Lord's Supper. And he's referring here to the fellowship with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. That Lord's Supper. As often as you do this, you declare the death of the Lord until out of which he comes. And that's when we eat the Lord's Supper. We participate in as united ones in the likeness of his death. That's the obedience from faith. That's the dying to self. That's getting our sin-infected mind out of the way. That's the participation, becoming united ones in the likeness of his death, where Paul wrote in 11:26, 1 Corinthians 11:26, as often as you do this, you declare, katangelo, you declare the death of the Lord. And then Paul wrote, until out of which, then God does his part, he comes. This is that realm of spiritually spoken worship. We volitionally die to self, and God faithfully responds to that, out of which he comes. And that's the wedding feast. That's the Lord's Supper. That's the realm of spiritually spoken worship. That's worship to the Father in spirit and in truth. That's the manifestation of those unknowable utterances. The rhema of Christ that our sin-infected minds cannot understand. But they're spoken through our mind, removed, having died to self, through the mind of Christ. 1 Corinthians 2:16. So I hope that you're able to see through all of this as we're talking about the epilogue of John. Why did John write this gospel at the end of the first century? A fourth gospel, dramatically different than the synoptics that were written a generation earlier, but completely consistent with them. John wanted to clarify this misinterpretation that was occurring in the Roman Catholic Church tradition, where they were using their misinterpretation to castigate, to impugn the Johannine Pauline churches, calling them Jewish Christians, if you will, probably saying they're not even really Christian because they're still following Jewish tradition, keeping the Jewish Passover, eating the Jewish Passover feast. They've not risen, transitioned to the new covenant. This is what they were being accused of. This is what John was bringing correction to say no. It was on Nisan 14, not Nisan 15. It was on Nisan 14 that they ate the meal in the upper room and that Jesus went to the cross. And this is the very essence of the so-called Quartodeciman controversy. Quartodeciman just means 14. The Quartodeciman controversy that raged throughout the 2nd century, and it was the cause of some vicious persecution against the 14 Nisan churches until they were finally persecuted away from the face of the church. And the Catholic Orthodox tradition spread throughout the Roman Empire, and Sunday became the only day where the Passion Week was celebrated, on the day of Jesus' resurrection. And the memory of the churches that celebrated on 14 Nisan celebrated the feast, the Lord's Supper, breaking fast on the day that Jesus died, 14 Nisan. That tradition faded away from the memory of the church. And the so-called Quartodecimans, that was probably a pejorative term given to them by the Romans, the so-called Quartodecimans that faded away were persecuted away from the church, and so their memory faded away, were eventually demonized, actually, in some of the later church councils, and called heretics. And that's how there's a phenomenon called damnatio memoriae, which is very prevalent in history, that the loser in a war is always, their memory is always condemned. It's called damnatio memoriae. And that happened with respect to the Pauline Johannine 14 Nisan tradition that represented the fullness of God's salvation plan. Their memory was damned. Their writings were burnt, were eradicated. We don't have any writings from the 14 Nisan tradition in the 2nd century. Why? Because they were destroyed. They represented a tradition that was persecuted away from the church, and so there's no way they were going to preserve the tradition in writings. And so we have some allusions to them, and even a few fragments where they're quoted in some of the works, such as Eusebius, the historian, and early in the 4th century, quotes some of the works from the 14 Nisan churches of the 2nd century. Very little, though, because Eusebius was a champion of Catholic orthodoxy. He was not going to do anything that would bring back the memory of 14 Nisan traditions. In fact, he was very active to continue the the damnatio memoriae. So a little bit of history about the church, a little bit of history about John, the Gospel of John, and why he wrote John. Important for you to know that. And so when you read the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John, you're now going to have some insight into why they use the term Passover differently. The Synoptics use Passover to refer to the meal in the upper room, and John specifically avoids that and uses the term Passover only to refer to the Jewish Passover day on the day after the crucifixion, on the day after the meal in the upper room, which John, in the beginning of chapter 13, just simply calls the supper meal. He does not call it the Passover. He calls it the Deipnon, the supper meal, the main meal of the day. Huge difference. That's why John was squarely addressing and correcting, bringing correction to the Paschal controversy that was already raging at the end of the 2nd century. Okay. Well, Robin said I'm an hour and a half in, so let me say a few words about the epilogue, and we'll continue this next week. There's a few words that I think will keep you thinking about what John is doing here in this epilogue story. So without repeating from last week, Robin, let's read the first passage, starting at chapter 21, verse 1. After these things, remember from last week, he's saying the first two comings of Jesus. After these things, Jesus manifested himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. But this time he manifested himself this way. They were together, Simon Peter and Thomas, who was called Didymus, and Nathan, who was away from Cana of Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and two others from his disciples. Simon Peter says to them, "I'm going away to fish." And they say to him, "We also will come with you." They went and boarded into the boat, and during the night they caught nothing. Second passage, Robin. Fishing in the light. Verse 4. But out of daybreak now happening, Jesus stood on the shore. However, the disciples had not actually known experientially that it's Jesus. In other words, the disciples in the boat, they didn't know who it was. None of them did. Therefore, Jesus says to them, "Disciplined ones, you do not have anything to eat, do you?" And we're going to talk about that question here today. They answered him, "No." Look how simple that exchange is. No. So he said to them, "Throw the net into the right-hand parts away from the boat, and you will find some." They threw the net, and they were no longer able to pull it away from the multitude of fish. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on in these two passages. We're going to sunset, pick up again next week. So after these things, go back to verse 1. Verse 1, right at the beginning. After these things. Very important here that when you read that, after these things, you trigger in your mind the first two comings where John used the word erchomai. Jesus came. Jesus came into the upper room where they had closed the doors. They were sealed in because they were afraid of the Jews. And Jesus came, erchomai. He came into the upper room the first time, "Peace be with you." And he came into the upper room the second time, this time with Thomas present, and began the same way, "Peace be with you." And he had the exchanges there in those two comings. Jesus, erchomai, he came on both of those occurrences. Okay? So, verse 1, after these things, a different verb. Jesus manifested himself. Now, I don't want you to walk away from that like, well, they mean the same thing. No. John didn't use words that way, and we'll talk about that in a subsequent teaching about how he uses agape and phileo later in that famous passage you're all aware of on Jesus asking Peter, "Do you love me?" Peter said, "Yes, you know I love you." And of course, two different verbs or two different nouns are being used there, agape and phileo, but only get translated into English as love. So, that's all to say. I want you to see here this word, Jesus manifested himself. And you can look in your English and see whatever word was translated. I use manifested for this verb phanerao, which means to manifest. It means to just what it says. To be made real is a good translation for it. It's made real. It becomes something real in the creation. So Jesus manifested himself. Jesus made himself in some way, some fashion, made himself manifest in the creation. Now don't leave that too quickly here. Let's talk about that. What's the difference between the two appearances in chapter 20 where the verb erchomai is used, where he came? Those two, Jesus came as himself. He didn't have to manifest something as real. Jesus was real and he came. It's a personification. Jesus came as his own person. In his own person, he came. Erchomai, he came. But here, John writes, Jesus manifested himself. That'll be something for you to just ponder and contemplate, because it may be a concept that doesn't snap readily to you. But let me put a sharp point on it here. In the first two appearances, Jesus didn't have to create anything. He just came. In this third one, John, the author, uses a different verb because he wants you to understand that something different is happening here. Jesus manifested himself. It means Jesus, wherever he is, whatever he's doing, is causing something of himself to become real in the creation, separate from him. You can see the same thing in the book of Romans, chapter 3, verses 22, where Paul writes in the realm of forensic justification, where God gives faith to believe. Paul writes, he's writing specifically, it's one of the few places where Paul actually writes specifically about the near purpose of God's salvation plan. And he writes in chapter 3, verse 22, that the righteousness of God has been manifested through the faith which is from Jesus Christ. Manifested. Jesus is sitting on the throne, but faith from Jesus is manifested in all those, the words are, in all those who are believing. Okay? Manifested. I want you to see here not Jesus in the person, even though he'll be represented standing on the shore. I don't want you to miss rhetorically that John has shifted his verbs here because he's representing something in this story figuratively. And so he's shifting, he's making a change here in the verb. Contemplate that, think about that. It's so important here right at the start to see that John is doing something here, even right out of the gate with the verb he uses. Jesus manifested himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. But this time, he manifested himself this way. Do you see this? That there's something different? This is the third. John will tell us later, he'll say, this is the third time Jesus manifested himself to the disciples. He'll say it later in this same passage. So just in the terminology here that he finishes up, you can see that John is using manifested here to show that there's something different going on with this particular appearance. Jesus manifested himself this time, this way. He's saying so something different about this occurrence, this manifestation. There's something different here than occurred in the first two occurrences where Jesus came. Erchomai. Verse 2. They were together. Okay? I want you to see a realm of fellowship here. They were together. They were in fellowship. Simon Peter and Thomas, who is called Didymus, and Nathan, who is away from Cana of Galilee. Nathan's an interesting one. I might comment on him here briefly. And the sons of Zebedee, who are James and John. Don't miss that. The sons of Zebedee, James and John. John, this is a different John. The sons of Zebedee are of the 12 apostles. The author of this gospel is not a member of the 12. He's an apostle. He's not one of the 12. and the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others from his disciples. And we can know from chapter 1 that the 2 others of his disciples are the beloved disciple and Andrew, the brother of Peter. We can know that from chapter 1. And we can know then that the author here is identifying himself, self-identifying himself, even though he never calls himself the John or the author John, I, John, writing this letter. We can know that he's identifying himself as the beloved disciple because he identifies in the very beginning the 2 disciples, the beloved disciple, and Andrew, the brother of Peter. And then all the way at the end of the letter, he identifies himself again at the end of chapter 21 as the beloved disciple, the one writing this letter, okay? And so we can know because of his reference to 2 other disciples that that's his allusion back to chapter 1 where he wrote about the 2 disciples who were with John the Baptist when he identified Jesus as the Lamb, the Son of the living God. Okay, verse 3. Oh, Nathaniel, before I do verse 3, Nathan is Nathaniel from the first chapter. Don't miss that here. He's the one who Jesus saw when he was sitting under the fig tree. And then, of course, Philip had the conversation with him and brought him to Jesus. And Jesus looked at him and said, Nathaniel, an Israelite in whom there is no deceit. And so what's going on there in chapter 1 that I want you to see in this Nathan here is that when Nathan was sitting under the fig tree, that's an allusion to Genesis chapter 3 and the fall, and where the first man and the first woman covered themselves with fig leaves when they walked away from the Lord. And Jesus is representing here the Israelites being under that same deception. I've taught about that before. I'm not going to do it again here today. But I want you to see here that this Nathan is the one Jesus said, you are sitting under the fig tree. You were under the deception of the Israelites, that you were misinterpreting Torah. You didn't understand it. And now, Philip calls him and brings him to Jesus. And Jesus now looks at Nathan and said, an Israelite who used to say, could anything good come from Nazareth? Now, Jesus looks at him and says, an Israelite in whom there is no deceit. Why? Because the veil has been torn away from Nathan's eyes. Why? From the preaching of the gospel. Philip talking to him. The veil pulled away. So Jesus would call Nathan an Israelite in whom there is no deceit. You were sitting under the fig tree. You were under the deception, the same deception of the first man and the first woman from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil who covered themselves with fig leaves. You were under that deception. That's the same deception that the Israelites fell under when God gave Torah to Moses. I saw you when you were sitting under the fig tree. But now, Nathaniel is coming to Jesus, and Jesus says, an Israelite in whom there is no deceit, because of the faith given to Nathaniel as a sovereign working of God, and the veil of Moses ripped away from his eyes, and the deceit is gone by the working of God from faith to believe. That's all going on there in chapter 1. This Nathan is that Nathaniel. It's one of the reasons why you can know that the 2 disciples here are the same 2 disciples from chapter 1. The beloved disciple, and Andrew, the brother of Peter, you can know that that's who's being represented here by two other disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going away to fish." And they said to him, "We also will come with you." They went and boarded into the boat. The word there is en bino. I'm not going to do a grammar on that right now, but it's an important word. En bino means boarded onto. That becomes important later when they get out of the boat. Again, when they come back to land, they apabino, they deboard the boat, which is different than Peter, who's in the water, and he comes out of the water, and they use the verb anabino. So you see the working of those three verbs here, a rhetorical effect here. En bino, to board into the boat. Apabino, to board out of the boat. The disciples, different from Peter, who anabino, comes out of the water when he comes back to land. We'll see all that. But right now, the author, John, uses the word en bino. They went and en bino boarded into the boat. And during that nighttime, think darkness of the world. During that night, they caught nothing. They were trying hard. They were trying their darndest to catch some fish. But under their strength, in the darkness of the world, their mind, their wits, their strength, they couldn't catch a thing. Verse 4, but out of daybreak now happening, the day, the light. God is light, and there is no darkness in him, none. 1 John chapter 1, verse 5. But now, out of daybreak happening, Jesus stood on the shore. However, the disciples had not actually known experientially that it's Jesus. None of them did. Keep that in mind, the disciples. Not the beloved disciple, nobody did. Nobody knew that it was Jesus standing on the shore. Therefore, Jesus says to them, disciplined ones, you hear that? Paideia, which we've already talked about in 1 John chapter 2. I think it is around verse 14-ish. Paideia, disciplined ones. Those are the ones who worship in spirit and truth, fellowship with the Father and his Son Jesus Christ, and get edified out of that. That's what makes them disciplined ones. It's not punishment for sin. That's not what paideia means here. That's paideia in the realm of being disciplined, in the realm of being trained up. But somebody's got to be doing the training. It's Jesus, who Mary Magdalene called Rabboni, teacher. Jesus, he's the teacher. He's still the teacher. He's still teaching today from the throne. To who? Those who will come to him. So keep in mind what's going on out here in the boat. They're in the boat, and Jesus calls them paideia. The boat, this little boat they're in on the sea, is a representation of being above the world. They're in the darkness, but they're above. The sea is the world. It's the abyss. Often in the Old Covenant, Old Testament, the sea was known as the place of the abyss. That's what's represented here by this Sea of Tiberias. Why do you think John calls it the Sea of Tiberias? In verse 1, he wants to make a reference, an allusion to the ruler of this world. Tiberius was the emperor of Rome during the ministry of Jesus. Tiberius is a representative of the ruler of this world. Now, it happens to be a city that was on the Sea of Galilee, but John's making an allusion here to the ruler of the world. So that's the allusion to the sea. The Sea of Tiberias is the world. And they're in a boat floating on the top of it. And Jesus calls them paideia. Why? They're going to be taught by Jesus. They're going to be disciplined by Jesus. Those who will enbino, who will board into the boat. He'll call it a little boat here as this passage progresses. It's a little boat, meaning there's not room for everybody. You'll see that when they can't pull the fish in. You see all these workings here. It's huge. Every word is pregnant, packed with meaning. Okay, therefore Jesus says to them, disciplined ones, paideia. And you should know there, he's talking to them as those disciples who will participate in the end purpose of God's salvation plan. Those who will come to Jesus. Disciplined ones. And then he asks them a rhetorical question. You don't have anything to eat, do you? Do you think Jesus was asking them because he didn't know? No, Jesus knew. But he's asking them, you don't have anything to eat, do you? And the disciples answer him, well, no, actually. What does that mean? This is the realm of edification. Jesus could ask in so many words here, if you want to get right to the figurative sense that John's representing here, Jesus could say, you, paideia, you who are in the little boat on the Sea of Tiberias, floating up above the Sea of Tiberias, you're not thinking with your own minds, are you? You don't have any food. Your minds have been removed, haven't they? And the disciples would answer that in the figurative sense, well, yeah, we have died to ourselves, Lord. We don't have our own food here. We've set that aside. You're going to have to ponder these things, church. This is what John is representing here in this epilogue story. You don't have anything to eat, do you? And they answered him, no. Of course we don't. We're sitting here speaking in unknowable utterances that we don't understand. Of course the answer is no. This is why Jesus calls them paideia. Paideia. Put the accent in the right place. Paideia. Disciplined ones. So Jesus said to them, throw the net into the right hand parts away from the boat, and you will find some. And I want you to see in the right hand parts away from the boat. I want you to understand that in the context of the righteousness of God. The righteousness of God is now working here. The right hand parts being cast away from the boat. Okay? Paul in chapter 3 verse 22, the righteousness of God has been manifested through the faith which is from Jesus Christ into everyone believing. That's what's happening right here. They're in the boat above the evil world, the Sea of Tiberias. They're in this boat. You can even picture the ark here, okay? You can picture the ark. They're rising above it. They're paideia. They're disciplined ones. They're operating not in their own minds. They have no food to eat, right? And Jesus said, throw it to the right hand parts of the boat, away from the boat. This net is the faith which is from Jesus Christ. I want you to see that here. They're operating out of their faith. It's the obedience from faith. They're throwing it in. Jesus then is saying a divinely guided order about where that net goes, where it lands, where it has effect. They've been trying all night and haven't caught a thing. God enters into the picture, and what happens? They throw the net, and they were no longer able to pull it in away from the multitude of fish. What does that mean here? When you see it in the most literal rendering of the words, you'll see this, but you won't see it in your English translations. It's so powerful when you stay as close as possible to the Greek. They threw the net, and they were no longer able to pull it away from the multitude of fish. The multitude of fish were always in the sea, but every time all through the night during the darkness, they were throwing the net out of their obedience from faith. They were throwing the net into the sea, and nothing was getting caught up in their net. And Jesus comes along, keep in mind, through the faith which is from Jesus Christ into all those believing. Jesus comes along and says, throw it into the right-hand parts. Okay? Now we're representing the righteousness of God. Throw it into the right-hand parts. It goes into the water and comes out with a multitude of fish that they can't pull the net away from. All night long they've been pulling in the net away from the multitude of fish. The fish were still there. The unbelievers are still in the world. But they were casting out according to their obedience from faith, drawing nothing in. But now they cast out to the right-hand parts, representing the righteousness of God, through the faith which is from Jesus Christ. The righteousness of God is manifested through the faith which is from Jesus Christ. And the net catches a multitude of fish. And the attraction is so strong. What does he say here? Therefore, they were no longer able to pull it away from the multitude of fish. Even if they tried, they couldn't pull it away. When that net got cast out into the right-hand parts away from the boat in the daylight, with the direction and the ordering of God himself, so that net represents the righteousness of God, the word of God going forth into the world. Remember how many times I've spoken about that? The rhema of Christ going into the world. It did its job. The net was filled with a multitude of fish that were always down there. They were always there, such that they couldn't pull the net away from those fish. The attraction was that strong. Even if they tried, they couldn't. The attraction of the faith thrown under the direction of the Lord, representing the righteousness of God, that faith was so strong, so powerful, that even if the disciples tried to pull it away from the multitude of fish, they couldn't. They were unable. The faith was sealed. Those multitude of fish that are caught up in this net are eternally secure. Nothing can separate them from the faith that they now have. The disciples were not able to pull the net away from the multitude of fish. I'm going to leave it there. The next passage is just too good to not do justice to it. So I'm going to pick up here verse 7 next week. I've given you a lot to think about here. You're getting a sense here that there's so much going on in this epilogue, in every word, pregnant with meaning, pregnant with figurative sense. Now, did this really happen? I believe so. I believe that John is representing, he was there. He's calling himself an eyewitness to this. There's no reason why we shouldn't believe that this event at the Sea of Galilee actually happened. But John is representing the full gospel through this event, especially pointing to this end purpose of God's salvation plan. And you're going to see here as this story progresses an amazing depiction of the ministry of Jesus Christ directly to and on behalf of those paideia, those disciples, those who will get into the little boat and go out onto the water in the darkness and without food to eat. Those who will do that, you're going to see an amazing depiction of Jesus' ministry to them, to those disciples, when they're finished with their work on the sea. What happens then? You're going to see it. You probably already kind of have a hint here, but it gets a whole lot better when you walk through it word by word, phrase by phrase, and see how the author is constructing that figurative meaning out of this actual event. So God bless you, church. I love talking to you about this stuff. It's so amazing when you can see or begin to see that fog begin to lift, and you see so much is represented in these scriptures about God's amazing salvation plan. I look forward to being with you again this next Sunday at 10:30, where we'll continue this. And on Wednesday, God willing, we'll be with Sarah with another Q&A. We'll see you then.
Wonderful, merciful Savior, precious Redeemer and friend, who would have thought that a lamb could rescue the souls of men? Oh, you rescue the souls of men. Counselor, Comforter, Keeper, Spirit we long to embrace. You offer hope when our hearts have hopelessly lost our way. Oh, we've hopelessly lost our way. You are the one that we praise. You are the one we adore. You give the healing and grace our hearts always hunger for. Oh, our hearts always hunger for. Almighty, infinite Father, faithfully loving your own, here in our weakness you find us, falling before your throne. Oh, we're falling before your throne. You are the one that we praise. You are the one we adore.